Welcome, everybody. I'm Mike Wong, a postdoc in astronomy and astrobiology, and I'd like to begin our colloquium with this quick land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the UW Astrobiology program resides upon the land of the Coast Salish peoples, land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And we recognize that we, the UW Astrobiology community, benefit from the occupation and use of this land, and that it is our responsibility to mend and forge our relationship with Indigenous peoples who are extant and vibrant members of the broader Seattle community. And if you just give me 1 second, I will throw in the chat. Where did my chat go? Chat. Some helpful links for you all to click on and check out if you'd like to learn more. Okay. And it is now my pleasure to introduce you all to Professor Sonia Tikoo. Dr. Tikoo majored in geology and minored in history at Caltech and earned her PhD in planetary sciences from MIT. From there, she went on to do a postdoc at UC Berkeley's Geochronology Center, and she was an assistant professor at Rutgers University for a few years before moving back to the West Coast as an assistant professor in geophysics and, by courtesy, geological sciences at Stanford University. Her research interests are in the application of paleomagnetism to problems in the planetary sciences, and today she'll be telling us about paleomagnetic insights into cratering processes, which I think will leave a giant impact on us all. sorry, only 2 more weeks of my terrible jokes.
I've been waiting to use that pun, I can tell.
All day long. Yeah, Sonia, you better save us for more of my comedy. The floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you, Mike, for that great introduction and also for inviting me to come speak to you all at UW. Wish could be there in person. So I'm just gonna full screen and hopefully you can see all my slides now. All right, great. So today I am very excited to talk to you about how we can use paleomagnetism to understand impact cratering processes. And today I'm going to have a large focus on what we are learning at the Chicxulub impact crater just off the coast of the Yucatan. But before I dive into those details, I thought I'd kind of give a broad overview about impact cratering and why it's awesome. So impact cratering is perhaps one of the first geological processes that we're introduced to, because even starting from a young age, we look up at the night sky and we see the moon, and we immediately see that the moon is covered in these circular features. It's covered in craters. There's big craters, small craters, old craters, young craters. We have 4 billion years of history like superposed onto one surface. And it's not just the moon. We look at Mars and we see that Mars is indeed covered with craters, and Mercury is covered with craters, and even small asteroids, bodies that are just a few kilometers across, are also themselves covered in craters. So what's immediately apparent is that impact cratering is the most ubiquitous process for modifying planetary surfaces, and it's a process that has been active for nearly all of solar system history, starting from whenever planetesimals first accreted and began to come together into larger bodies. So if we go around the Earth today, we have had about 200 or so craters be identified and confirmed, and that number is constantly increasing. And that's despite the fact that the Earth has processes like erosion and tectonic recycling, which serve to destroy craters over geological time. As you can tell, most craters are found on land. Very rarely do we find them in the oceans because they're just covered with water and tons of sediment and they're hard to discover, but they are there. But regardless, we have quite an extensive impact record, even preserved on our own planet. And impacts have a good significance, not just because they put holes in the ground, but because they can have other effects like perturbing global climate. And for example, the dinosaurs found out the hard way 66 million years ago that an asteroid impact could, change the climate and change dynamics on Earth enough that you could have mass extinctions under certain circumstances when you have large impacts. But impacts don't just have the potential for vast destruction. Impacts can also sometimes serve to create new environments, because there are, whenever impacts occur, they fracture the Earth's crust, and water can percolate down into the crater and be heated by the heat of the impact melt sheet from the crater as that cools into the surrounding rocks. And you can produce these vast subsurface impact-generated hydrothermal systems. And as these hydrothermal systems cool, they may have actually become good habitats for thermophilic life. And because bacteria, they can take advantage of nutrients that, are leached from rocks and then sort of dissolved into the water. And so as a result of this process, impacts could actually be an interesting environment, and they may have in fact been a relatively common environment in the earlier stages of Earth history. So if we take a look at this plot, what we're looking at is the number of impacts going back in time, starting from the present to 4.5 billion years ago, counting upwards from the present where there are not any large basin forming impacts. Those are impacts that create craters with 300 kilometers diameter or more. And as you go back in time, that number will increase essentially. And it turns out that if we are looking at the time period when life was perhaps first emerging and first developing on the Earth, say during the early to end of the Archean, you might have had about 15 basin forming impacts. So again, impacts that create 300 kilometer diameter craters and larger. But if you go a bit smaller to something the size of Chicxulub Crater, which is about 150 kilometers diameter across, during that same period of time, you would have more than 100 Chicxulub craters. So, these types of impacts were occurring more often back then, and you might have had more of these environments start to develop back then as a result of these impacts. So what I wanted to work on and bring sort of my perspective to these kinds of questions about impact cratering and their processes, I wanted to see what could I do as a paleomagnetist, someone who studies the ancient magnetism preserved in rocks. How could a rock magnetist contribute to our understanding of impact cratering processes and their effects? And so it turns out that magnetism is actually a great way to study impact processes, because there's a few things that happen during impacts that can lead to the acquisition of magnetization in rocks. So the first of these is a process called shock remnant magnetization. If you have a target rock within the Earth's crust, that rock probably formed in the presence of the Earth's geodynamo magnetic field, which has been around for at least the last 3.5 billion years, perhaps longer. And whenever rocks form, igneous rocks form, they tend to, record an ancient magnetization in the direction of whatever field was present at the time that the rock formed. And let's say that later on in Earth history, let's say the orientation of the Earth's magnetic field changed. And if you have an impact occur, a shock wave is going to propagate through the Earth's crust. And as that shock wave propagates through, little grains that are easy to remagnetize, those weak grains are going to acquire a new magnetization in the direction of the current magnetic field. And as the wave propagates through, more and more of these easy to remagnetize grains will acquire that new magnetization. And so that's called a shock remnant magnetization. And this has been shown to occur in shock experiments in the laboratory. However, enigmatically, we have not actually observed it in natural samples yet. And one reason for this is that since this magnetization is recorded in grains that are easily remagnetized, they can be remagnetized again later by processes that have nothing to do with shock. They could be remagnetized by impact-related heating, or they can be remagnetized by, hydrothermal activity, or by, long-term contamination from the Earth's magnetic field. It's called a viscous remnants. So we don't really see this, even though we know it happens. Then the second way that impacts can magnetize rock, which I think we see a bit more often, is called thermal remnant magnetization. So here again, we're going to start out with a rock that has a pre-existing magnetization direction, and we're going to have an impact take place, and that's going to regionally heat rocks in this part of the Earth's crust. And as these rocks experience heating, magnetic grains who get heated above what's called their blocking temperature. So the maximum, blocking temperature for like, let's say the mineral magnetite is its Curie temperature, that's 580 degrees Celsius, but rocks can even be remagnetized at lower temperatures if these individual grains have a lower blocking temperature. But regardless, as these rocks get heated and cool back down, they can acquire a new thermal remnant magnetization. So you can learn about impact heating processes from magnetism. And then the third way that impacts can remagnetize rocks is by chemical remnant magnetization. What does that mean? After an impact, you may introduce a lot of fractures into the Earth's crust, and water can move into those fractures. And if the water is hot, it can create chemical reactions that either destroy existing magnetic grains or they can create new magnetic grains. And as new magnetic grains form as a result of these reactions in the hydrothermal system, they can again record a new magnetization in whatever direction the Earth's field is in at the time that the new grains form. So throughout all of these processes, we are able to remagnetize rocks thanks to an impact. And so I'm going to talk about how we use paleomagnetism and magnetic signatures recorded in rocks to study the Chicxulub Crater. So I think we've all at least heard of Chicxulub Crater. The impact occurred 66 million years ago, and it marks the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary in the associated mass extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs and many other species. But the crater itself is almost 200 kilometers across, and it's the result of a 10-kilometer or so impactor hitting the Earth, kind of where the present-day Yucatan Peninsula is. And what's interesting about the Chicxulub Crater is that magnetism was part of the story from the very beginning, because it actually played a role in how the crater was discovered. So back in the day, the Alvarez paper came out that hypothesized that the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction was caused by the impact of an asteroid. And so it predicted that it would probably be an asteroid about 10 kilometers across, kind of a larger body. And we didn't know where the crater was. But years later, there was a gravity and magnetism geophysical survey of the Yucatan that was being conducted by the Pemex oil company. And one of the employees basically did this survey and found this circular magnetic anomaly right off the coast of the Yucatan. And so there are strong magnetic anomalies, both in the positive and negative directions in this perfectly circular region. And there's also a gravity anomaly associated with it. So actually the discovery of the crater is a magnetic story in and of itself. For some reason, which I might get into later in this talk, impact rocks have strong magnetizations relative to the background. So Chicxulub Impact Crater is a peak ring crater. So as you can see, we have an outer ring and inner ring, and then there's something called a peak ring on the inside. So what is a peak ring? A peak ring is a rim of mountains in the interior of a crater. It's about halfway out from the center of the crater to the very edge most of the time. So a peak ring crater is simply a crater that contains a peak ring. And it occurs whenever you have a crater of a sufficient size. So if you have a very small crater, you might create a pit. If you have a crater about 1 kilometer across on the Earth, you'll get a simple bowl shape that's called a simple crater. A larger crater will not just have a bowl. After the impact, part of the Earth's crust is going to rebound in the center and form a mountain in the center called the central peak. A peak ring crater, that central peak continues to collapse and form a donut-shaped ring of mountains. And then finally, the largest impacts, things that are close to 1,000 kilometers across, can form multi-ring basins. And so essentially the diameter at which a peak ring crater forms is inversely related to a planet's gravity. And on Earth, this transition to forming a peak ring happens at about 50 kilometers diameter. So Today's question is going to be, what does remnant magnetization preserved within the peak ring of Chicxulub tell us about impact processes that occurred while the crater was forming as well as after the impact? And I'm just going to do a shout out to my grad student, Christina Verhagen. She has been the one doing most of the day-to-day lab work on this topic. And so she's currently writing up her papers for her thesis on this. So all of this started in about 2016, whenever the International Ocean Discovery Program and the International Continental Scientific Drilling Program joined forces and created IODP Expedition 364, which used a mission-specific platform type of boat, not the US's normal scientific drilling vessel, to drill into the peak ring of Chicxulub Crater, so in the water, not on land. And part of the main reason for why they initially decided to drill into the peak ring was they wanted to test how do peak ring craters actually form. They wanted to test this idea called the dynamic collapse hypothesis. So the way this hypothesis works is that after you have an impact take place, the Earth's crust and upper mantle start to rebound in the center. And then according to this computer model, what happens is that this material slumps outward and downward and forms a mountain kind of here and here near the kind of halfway out point within the crater. And so we wanted to see if this model is actually correct to describe how these large craters form. And the key observation that we wanted to see in this model was, as you can see, the peak ring out here gets made up of material from the crust, like the granitic continental crust. So we should have a bunch of uplifted granite from several kilometers, tens of kilometers deep in the peak ring. So in 2016, they did this drilling expedition, and I was not actually on the boat because they could only have about 11 scientists on there at that time. But nevertheless, they brought up a whole bunch of rocks. There were lots of post-impact sedimentary rocks. You can see the layering here in the core samples. And they also did some preliminary studies in labs on the ship to look at the rocks from the crater itself. And the point at which I joined the story and most other scientists joined the story was after the expedition, they sent the samples to Bremen, Germany, where there's an IODP core repository. And the core repository is pretty spectacular. They have like hundreds of, maybe thousands of core sections all stacked up in this giant cold warehouse. And we began to actually look at the samples in the real lab and start to document its properties and also do preliminary analyses. And what we found, actually, whenever we looked at the lithologies present in the drill core, were sure enough, there were post-impact sediments. But then once we got below those sediments, we found impactite rocks. Those are breccias, which contain fragments of impact melt rocks. Sometimes they're called swavites. There were also just pure impact melt rocks that were not clast rich, just molten rock that we found underneath these breccia fragments. But then underneath that was the clincher. We found about an 800-meter or so sequence of granitoid basement rocks. So this is that uplifted material that's predicted to happen in the dynamic collapse hypothesis. So we did manage to demonstrate that the peak ring of craters forms from material that originates at depth, confirming that hypothesis, and that was published in Morgan et al. 2016 in Science. All right, so now that we have this confirmation, we can infer the structure of the Chicxulub crater in general. So we have post-impact sedimentary rocks. Then you have other sediments that get overlain by uplifted crustal rocks. There are impact melt rocks and breccias on top of that. So now that we know the types of rocks that we're working with, we want to start to decipher the magnetization that we actually observe in these lithologies from the peak ring of Chicxulub crater. So I'm basically going to break this talk into two parts. I'm first going to talk about the impactite rocks. So these are these breccias and impact melt rocks that are produced by the impact itself and that constitute the uppermost section of the peak ring. And then after I talk about what we learned from those, I'm going to get into the lower part of the peak ring, which has these granitoid rocks in it. And as you can see, like these rocks are pretty messed up. Like look at this cataclastic structure. These granites are not your countertop, folks. Like you pick them up and sometimes they fall apart in your hands because they are so shocked as a result of this impact. All right, so the first thing we did with these samples was we just wanted to see how strong the magnetization was in each of these lithologies. So what we did was we took core samples from each rock type and we measured them, their natural remnant magnetization in our magnetometers. And what we found was that the strongest rocks within the crater are the impact melt rocks magnetically. They're followed up by the breccias or the swavites that have some impact melt components inside them. There are also some pre-impact dolerite dikes that are strongly magnetized. Basaltic rocks and dolerites also tend to have fairly strong magnetizations even outside the impact setting, so that's not surprising. The granitoids are a bit weaker. And the weakest magnetizations present in our samples were the sedimentary rocks that were deposited after the impact. So they were about 2 orders of magnitude weaker than the granitoids. So the takeaway that we learned from this study, and also the fact that the magnetic susceptibility values for each of these lithologies are ordered in a qualitatively similar way. Susceptibility is a measure of basically the concentration of magnetic material in your sample. So like samples with higher susceptibility have more magnetic stuff than samples with low susceptibility. What we learned is that the strongest magnetizations are being sourced from the impact melt rocks. And what we're doing next is we're actually trying to plug the magnetization values we got from this analysis into some forward models of the magnetization present in the crust at Chicxulub. And we're trying to see if we can reproduce the kind of gravity and magnetic anomaly pattern that we see from aeromagnetic surveys from this data set. That work is in progress and it's not quite done yet, but I just wanted to mention it. So the next thing we want to do is actually look at the magnetization itself, not just its intensity, but also its properties and its direction in the upper peak ring. So the way we study the magnetism in rocks is that we need to identify how many different components of magnetization are in a single sample. And what I mean by that is that magnetizations are vectors. Each magnetization component in a rock has its own magnitude and its own direction. And sometimes rocks can have multiple magnetizing events. So a rock is an assemblage of grains, and there are some grains that are tougher and more resistant to remagnetization. And there are other grains that are weaker and less resistant to remagnetization. So these are the blue ones here. The natural remnant magnetization of a rock is the resultant vector of all of the individual magnetic components that are present. So if we look at magnetic directions, and let's just think in terms of 2 dimensions with north and east, here's the NRM, that's what we have in the rock before we do anything to it. Then we want to stepwise demagnetize the sample to reveal the vectors that are present. So we might demagnetize it in an alternating field, 2 millitesla, 5 millitesla, 10 millitesla fields until we've randomized and completely removed any overprint components. And then we keep demagnetizing it until we identify an origin trending vector, which is the original magnetization in a rock at the time that it formed. So we conducted a bunch of these demagnetization experiments on samples from the upper peak ring of Chicxulub Crater, which are those swavites and impact melt rocks. And we tried to look at this origin trending direction, like what is the main magnetization component in these rocks? And we couldn't orient the core's azimuth because when you drill that deep, it's really hard to keep track of the declination of your core. So we were just looking at the inclination of the magnetizations only. And so what we found is that across the peak ring, we found that most samples had a magnetic inclination of close to -45 degrees, which is actually the inclination that is expected to have been there at the time of the Chicxulub impact at the location of the Yucatan Peninsula. Back then, the Earth's magnetic field had the reversed polarity compared to how it is today. So you might have heard that the Earth's magnetic field switches orientation every few 100,000 years. So it had the opposite orientation as today. And so the swath of black points with negative inclinations is broadly consistent with an impact origin of magnetism. But we also had a bunch of points here that had positive inclinations, which had a more enigmatic source. So we wanted to dive into that. But first of all, let's go with a simple case. At the very base of this sequence where we have all of these impact melt rocks that we know cooled from high temperatures, temperatures above the Curie temperature of magnetite, we know these rocks acquired a uniform thermal remnant magnetization. So we figured out the story for the impact melts. And the fact that these rocks contain a thermal origin magnetization is consistent with the expression of magnetite grains in these rocks if you look at them under a microscope. So in these rocks, there are magnetite grains, which are the bright white dots in the backscatter images, and they're sort of uniformly spread out amongst these impact melts. So this uniform distribution of magnetic carriers is consistent with a thermal origin magnetization. Then let's move farther up into these breccias that have more scattered directions. One thing that we noticed that was interesting was some breccias had directions that were almost antipodal to each other. So if we took a core sample from this section of the core down here, and we took another core sample from the same core, so since they're from the same core, we can orient them with respect to each other. And if we look at their magnetization directions on a stereo net, equal area stereo net, what we find is that they had essentially antipodal directions almost. So that was interesting. And we observed this kind of scatter in directions a few times. So we wanted to see, okay, what is the origin of these kind of different magnetic inclinations that we're seeing in these rocks? So we thought there were two hypotheses that could explain a scatter in magnetic directions. The first one is that these breccias consist of clasts that are randomly oriented with respect to each other. And this makes sense. These breccias contain clasts that had original target rock and impact melt rock fragments that were washed in as a result of, you had the impact, there was kind of the loss of water from that region, and eventually there was a resurge as the ocean returned, and it brought a bunch of these clasts back with it, and they were deposited. So the idea is maybe each class has its own direction, and whichever sample that you're sampling is being dominated by the magnetism in a given class. The other hypothesis is that of chemical remnant magnetization, or maybe you have some clasts with pre-existing magnetization, but the primary magnetic signal is the result of new magnetite grains that are being precipitated from the impact crater hydrothermal system. And so those grains would have recorded whatever the field direction was at the time that this new magnetite precipitated, which is presumably close to the inclination of the impact. So around -45 degrees initially, at least. So there's copious evidence for hydrothermal channels and hydrothermal activity in the upper peak ring. So if you look at some of these breccias, you can see here's a hydrothermal channel. Here's another hydrothermal channel that's full of this orange mineral called analcime. There's another hydrothermal channel from another breccia section. There's even some hydrothermal veins present in the granitoids that are lower in the crater. But regardless, there's tons of secondary minerals that are present. We found pyrites, we found some clays, some of these other orange minerals that are present. But most notably for my study is that oftentimes around clasts, we found a secondary magnetite that had precipitated from the hydrothermal system. And so we had some petrographic evidence of the secondary magnetite occurring. And then here is another sample, and this sample actually had a magnetic inclination that is positive, so had the same orientation as what we see today, not at the time of the impact. And what we saw in that particular sample was that there was a bunch of magnetite that was secondary magnetite that formed around a sulfide grain. So we might have evidence for a very long-lived hydrothermal system that produced iron sulfides and iron oxides at different times. But regardless, you have some evolution of the chemistry of the hydrothermal system being recorded petrographically and perhaps magnetically in these rocks. Here's another sample that had primary magnetite and secondary sulfides and secondary magnetite all in the same sample. And if you look at the scale bar, that's only 100 microns. So even within less than a millimeter, you can have extreme heterogeneity in the iron minerals that are present in these rocks. So the question we were trying to address was, is the distribution of inclinations that we see in these breccias random, which would support the rotating clasts hypothesis, or is it non-random, which would support the chemical remnant magnetization hypothesis? And so what we did was, in order to test this further, we took a solid block of breccia and we sliced it into a bunch of different slices, which contained both pieces that had clasts and matrix, as well as pieces that just had clasts. And what we found was that there is some variation in declinations, which is a little odd, but all of these samples had inclinations in the same hemisphere, and most samples had clustered inclinations and declinations. So what this tells us is that we're kind of favoring a hydrothermal origin for the magnetization based on this type of clustering that we're observing. Then if you want to look at a theoretical sample, which would have lots of randomly oriented clasts, the distribution of inclinations you would observe in this idealized sample would resemble a histogram or a sine wave with a peak at around 0. Should I say cosine, not a sine? And what we see in the inclination distributions in these breccia units is that, yeah, there is a biasing, but it's not at 0, which would imply random magnetizations. It's at close to negative 45 degrees, or even in the normal polarity samples, close to positive 40 degrees. So that was a second peak that we observed there. So all in all, we kind of concluded that we had a strong case for hydrothermally imparted magnetization in these rocks. And this stood up to some tests for randomness that we did to try to see, okay, we only had 36 samples from this lithology. Like, what are the chances we got this distribution by random chance? And it ended up being very low. Like, we had a 95% confidence of a non-random result. So what we concluded is that, okay, the Earth's magnetic field reverses back and forth every few 100,000 years. Rocks record the field direction at the time that they form or at the time that they experience alteration. So we might have had our original breccias, which had their original magnetic minerals in them. And due to the high porosity of these breccias, like their porosities are close to 30%, 35%. So they can have a copious flow of hydrothermal fluids going through them. And if that hydrothermal system persisted for a very long time, you could have recorded changes in the Earth's magnetic field direction as that system evolved, until you have a final rock with its new magnetic minerals, which may record a different field direction. And so if this was the case, in terms of how the magnetization in these rocks was acquired, it would imply that the hydrothermal system lasted for at least 150,000, maybe longer years, because the impact itself took place at about 66.02 million years ago, and the next geomagnetic reversal after the impact was at least 150,000 years later, according to different geochronology studies. This one's a uranium-lead study, and this one's from argon dating. How do we compare these ages to models of hydrothermal system evolution at Chicxulub? Well, the model suggests that given a range of permeabilities that span about 2 orders of magnitude, potential permeabilities, you could have a hydrothermal system that lasted for up to 2 million years at Chicxulub Crater. So having a minimum duration of a couple 100,000 years is not necessarily crazy. Then how can we look at this problem through thermochronology as an alternate approach? Different geochronometers are sensitive to different temperature ranges. So we can study different minerals and obtain geochronologic ages from different mineral separates with different closure temperatures. And we can try to see when were each of these minerals' ages reset, perhaps by a hydrothermal system. And we think based on the mineralogy in the Chicxulub hydrothermal system, the initial peak temperature was probably around 350 degrees C, and it cooled from there. So we're gonna look at the lower temperature range of these minerals on this chart. And so we did uranium, thorium, helium, of zircon and apatite, and we also did argon-argon geochronology of feldspar minerals in these rocks. And what we found, I'm going to start with the feldspars first because this result is pretty interesting, is that there are some standards for the age of Chicxulub Crater from previous studies, which all clustered around 66 million years ago. Those are those blue curves and the gray curve here. But when we look at samples from the impact breccias and impact melt rocks at Chicxulub, particularly the breccias, you get these ages that come younger and younger. So we have some at 65.3, and then we have some really crazy young ones like 62.5 million years ago that also show up in populations of authogenic feldspars. So what this might tell us is that we could have had a hydrothermal system that lasted for even millions of years present in the argon data, potentially. There could also be other just low temperature aqueous alteration that could do that same thing, but we have to look into that further. That's why this work's not published yet. But that was work done by Anne-Marie Pickersgill at Glasgow. And then we have Cornelia Rasmussen, who is now at UT Austin, and she's been doing the uranium, thorium, helium dating of zircons and apatites from the crater. And similarly, we have found ages for zircon in particular that come from a bit after the age of the impact. And so this might be some additional evidence for sort of a protracted, possibly hydrothermal, definitely aqueous alteration history. But the net takeaway from this is that Chicxulub Crater appears to have, whether you look at magnetism or modeling or thermochronology, it appears to have had a vast, long-lived subsurface hydrothermal system. And so the duration of that hydrothermal system kind of informs as to the timing of habitability. How long does it take to cool below around 110 degrees Celsius, which is when you can start to have more, thermophilic life forms inhabiting a region. And especially because we can use magnetism to sort of help us with that. We think that, hydrothermal magnetite in this case probably can form at temperatures of above 50 degrees Celsius, around 120 degrees Celsius or so. So that kind of gives us a range of a few 100,000 years is how long it took to get to that point. So we can apply that to sort of a time temperature curve. We have some recent evidence from looking at these framboidal pyrite grains, so iron sulfide grains in the Chicxulub breccias that exist. And if we look at their sulfur isotope signatures, and I'm not an isotope geochemist, nor am I a biologist, but essentially there seems to be evidence of a fractionation of sulfur isotopes that is indicative of microbial reduction of sulfate. And these framboidal pyrites occur in the secondary hydrothermal clays that formed. So we do even have some evidence that at Chicxulub Crater, the hydrothermal system may have been a habitat for microbial life, which is pretty cool. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about in the last few minutes is we also wanted to look at the magnetization in the lower part of the peak ring to learn about impact processes there. And this is sort of separate from the upper peak ring story because we don't have as many like impact melt materials there. We are dealing with primarily fractured up target rocks. And so I'm going to go into a little bit of a history of where these rocks came from, these basement rocks. So this is continental crustal granitoids that formed around 326 million years ago. And these target granitoids were intruded by dolerite dikes very shortly after that time, around 320 million years ago. So what we know has happened to these rocks at and after the time of impact is that they were shock altered by the passage of an initial shock wave. We can do shock barometry from looking at shock effects in individual minerals, and we can constrain the shock pressure that these granitoids experienced to around 20 gigapascals. So that also imparted a bunch of porosity in these granitoids. And these granitoids actually have a porosity of around 10 to 11%, which is really high since the porosity of normal granite is pretty close to zero. These rocks were uplifted from depths of about 10 kilometers, and ultimately they were emplaced relatively shallowly as a result of crater modification processes They were also intruded by impact-related melt and swavite, so basically impact melt containing breccia dikes. And then they were hydrothermally altered, which is a secondary event on top of all of this stuff that these rocks have already been through. So these granitoids have been through a lot at and after their history. So impact history. So one thing that we know that happened while these granitoids were moved around during the impact is that whenever large impacts occur, they actually change the rock's behavior so that they don't behave like a solid rock anymore. They start to behave like a fluid and they start to flow. And so this process is called acoustic fluidization. And so what ends up happening is we might even see some signatures of that acoustic fluidization in the magnetic minerals that are present inside the granitoids. So what we have found is that oftentimes there are cracks that formed, and you see that some of these iron oxide magnetite grains, they look like they have been sheared, just sheared apart during this fluidization process. There's also some potential for individual grains to have been physically remobilized along cracks. And so this is a pretty gnarly fate for these magnetite grains as they've been sort of moved around in these craters during the crater during deformation. There's also, if we look at cataclysmic areas, what we can see is that there's iron oxide grains that are just totally fractured. So that's another effect that we see that's impact generated. Then one thing we noticed that was interesting was there wasn't that much secondary hydrothermal magnetite in the solid granite portions. But if you got to granites or boundaries that happen to be at boundaries with dolerite dikes, so here on this plot, there's a dike here. On this cartoon. And so if we look at the boundary regions between dolerite dikes and the granitoid basement, we start to see more secondary magnetite minerals forming. So what we have here is we have some primary iron oxide and sulfide primary iron oxide grains, and then you have this clay here. And within this secondary hydrothermal clay, we have iron oxides that precipitated out from the hydrothermal system. Another expression of this is here you have a clay that has some older pre-existing iron oxides, and then there was a crack, and then you have secondary iron oxides forming along that crack as a result of hydrothermalism. And similarly, we have another crack in a different part of a granite that's again near a dolerite dike that's pretty beat up and has a lot of fractures in it. And you can see again, there's secondary white iron oxides forming there as well. So one thing that we noticed is that these contacts between dikes and the granites that they intrude may have been interesting pathways for hydrothermal fluids to move throughout the crater. Then what we tried to do was we tried to compare the magnetic directions that are present in different portions of the granite to the magnetic directions that are present in the different lithologies that intrude the granite. So this plot is a bit of a mess to interpret, so I'm going to walk you through it. On the left, what I'm showing you is the inclination of the magnetization in rocks versus depth. This is the lower peak ring. And then on the right side is the declination of the magnetization in the rocks versus depth. And the black points are unbaked granites. Those are granites that are not near any pre-impact or or impact related dikes. So they're just doing their own thing. Dolerite dikes, which formed again long before the impact, are shown in dark blue. Granites that are close to these dolerite dikes, enough that they may have been thermally heated by the intrusion of those dikes, are shown in light blue. Impact related dikes are shown in red, and granites that could have been baked by the intrusion of impact related dikes are shown in orange. And so what we tried to do was we tried to see if there were any trends in the data in terms of the magnetic directions that we see. And so what we found was that most baked granites in the crater contain a magnetic component that reflects baking from whatever intruded it nearby. So in the case of the bottom of what we collected from the peak ring, we have a bunch of impact melt rocks and the granites that were baked by those impact melt rocks have similar magnetic inclinations. We tried to use CT imaging to reconstruct the declination of magnetizations in the granites. This was not possible in the swaleites because the particle sizes were too small to kind of reconstruct orientations. But in the granites, we had these larger scale fractures, and we could actually trace those fractures from core section to core section and put this together. This didn't work that well in the impact melt section, but as you can see, at least in the inclination space, you do have clustered magnetizations that reflect reheating. We found that granites that were not really baked, granites that were not really baked don't have a magnetization direction that is consistent with the surrounding, dolerites or anything like that, because they were too far away. Another thing we noticed that was interesting was that, we have some baked granites up here that have the same magnetization direction as the dolerite dikes, but we also have, this is what I wanted to get at, we have other granites that do not appear to have been affected by dike intrusion, but do have magnetization directions that are consistent with the time of the impact. So these might be consistent with some kind of post-impact hydrothermalism process. So all in all, it's a pretty complicated record in the granites, but the takeaway is that in cohesive areas of granite that are not affected, we think that these granites are retaining their original pre-impact magnetization directions from primary magnetic grains. Near dolerite dikes, a lot of them have been baked by the intrusion of those dolerites, and they retain a thermal remnant magnetization. Near impact melt rocks, those granites have also been baked, and they record a thermal magnetization from the baking of the impact materials. But then there is this region where if you're looking at the contacts between the dikes and the granites, those contacts have magnetization directions that are similar to either the impact direction or the antipode of the impact direction. So these may be signatures of post-impact chemical remnant magnetization from the hydrothermal system in just these little pockets in the granite. So the takeaway is that dike contacts may act as conduits for hydrothermal fluids. And indeed, if we look again at some maps of these samples that are at dike contacts, you can see that there is evidence for kind of different compositions of fluid flow occurring along these cracks here. So in summary, from all of our studies of the Chicxulub crater, we have evidence for a pervasive, apparently long-lasting, at least a few, more than 150,000-year-old hydrothermal system that likely imparted a chemical remnant magnetization in breccias at Chicxulub crater, which were highly porous and permeable. And the duration of the distribution of the system may have affected how habitable the crater environment was as this hydrothermal system cooled down over time. The plumbing of this hydrothermal system is extremely complicated and can result in different secondary iron mineralogies on sub-centimeter and even sub-millimeter length scales as the hydrothermal system evolved over time. And then the second part of our study, we learned that the granitoid basement is extremely magnetically complicated, but it does contain some combination of magnetization from before the time of the impact, as well as magnetization resulting from the time of the impact, either by baking of granites from high temperature dikes that were intruded at the time of the impact, or later from chemical remnant magnetization that formed during the hydrothermal system lifetime. And kind of a secondary corollary of the second result is that if we do in fact retain pre-impact magnetizations in the granites, and we have evidence for this from all of those inclinations that were near zero, they were not near -45 or +45. So if that is actually pre-impact magnetization, it constrains the impact shock temperatures to well below the Curie temperature of magnetite, which is 580 degrees C. And that is consistent with our peak temperature of the hydrothermal system that we interpret from some of the secondary mineralogies that we find, which is around 350 degrees C. So all in all, we can learn about thermal histories, we can learn about hydrothermal histories, and the hope is that we can continue to learn about these types of impact processes and maybe extend them to studying other craters or even other places within Chicxulub Crater. So thank you very much, and I am happy to take questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Sonia. Everybody, please throw up those clapping emojis. Right before we go to questions, I want to steal this moment to announce that next week's seminar is going to be at 2 p.m. Pacific time, so 1 hour earlier than usual. So I just wanted to get that out there before people maybe need to run off to their next thing. And now we'll turn to questions for Sonia. There are 2 ways for you to do this. You can either throw your question into the chat, or you can find your raise hand button under the reactions tab on Zoom, and I'll call on you to unmute and ask your question. So we already have one question from a direct message to me from Nancy. Nancy is wondering if you can explain why the planet changes its magnetic field every so many thousands of millions of years.
Yeah, so that's actually probably the $64,000 question in planetary magnetism. We know that magnetic reversals are expected to happen due to sort of changes in core fluid flows over time. But exactly what triggers them at any given time, like that's still kind of enigmatic. It's very difficult to model the flow of core fluids on sort of a continuous basis using magnetohydrodynamic simulations, because it would take forever, even if you had the world's best supercomputer, and it's very difficult to do. And we can't even simulate like the resolution of fluid flow in the core. So all we have are these like snapshots of like how the field would look at one instant in time. And if we move forward to another instant in time, we do observe that reversals occur in all simulations, but we don't know the exact triggering of how the flow changes in order to do that. So
right.
It's an open question.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe Nancy, you can help solve it.
There's a coupling of the fluid with the magnetic field too. So it's not like one only drives the other. There's a feedback between the field and the fluid as well. So
complex coupled system. Yeah. Wow. Anybody else have a question?
Let's see. I have a question.
Sure, go for it.
This is Don Brownlee. I was wondering about these, basin forming impacts or sub-basin forming impacts, and their role in producing habitable areas on icy bodies, such as Pluto and Titan, because there are a lot of cold bodies in the universe, and it's interesting if you can open up a warm hydrothermal activity region that maybe lasts for a couple million years. That's extremely interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely an avenue that could merit further exploration. You have to have the right combination of fluid as well as the chemistry in order to kind of facilitate the formation of biomolecules or even facilitate just metabolic processes once you have cells. But yeah, I think it's definitely something that could be worked on.
Great. Any other questions for Sonia? Yes, we have one in the chat from Siegfried Egel. Asks if, could you explain what parameters determine whether or not hydrothermal activities arise? Is the size of the impactor important to that?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different variables involved here, but of course, the larger the impact you have, the larger region you're going to impart fracturing into, and you're also going to have formation of a central melt sheet within the crater, and it's the cooling of that melt sheet that is sort of the heat engine for the hydrothermal system. So if you're going to have larger impacts with more fracturing and more heat, that's definitely going to work in your favor towards having a long-lived hydrothermal system. Then smaller craters are not necessarily going to be able to do that as well. You also have to have water, which is another key ingredient here, which can either be sort of meteoric water that's already present in the crust, or also in the case of Chicxulub, which is a marine impact originally, you could have influx of seawater moving downward into the crater. And at least initially, temperatures are so high that it's difficult for water to move down because it gets turned into steam before it can percolate low enough into the crater. But eventually it cools down enough. And if you're at depths and pressures where you can maintain water in sort of a fluid state moving through the crater as well. So yeah, I'd say that the main driver is the size of the crater that's produced, which is related to the size of the impactor, but you want to think of it in terms of a 1/2 mv squared relationship for the kinetic energy of the impact. So the size of the impactor will affect its mass, but another thing that can affect it is its velocity, so where in the solar system it's coming from. So if you have like a comet from the outer solar system, you might have, a larger crater form than if you have something from the inner solar system that has the same density. So yeah, but it basically comes down to the size of the crater and whether you have water. Yeah.
And a question in the chat from Alan. Alan asks, does angle of impact have any bearing on fracturing?
Yes, that's a good question. It is possible to do 3D simulations of impacts, although it's computationally more difficult, but I'm trying to think in my head really quickly what a quick answer would be to this. I think that it definitely changes the distribution of fracturing in the floor of the crater, where you would have more fracturing in like the downrange direction than the uprange. And there's also a different amount of melt that's produced depending on if you have a vertical impact versus an oblique impact. If you have a vertical impact, you're going to melt, I think, more of the crust in that region, whereas in the oblique impact, you might brecciate some more rocks and have some more ejecta deposited and maybe slightly less melting. But yeah, it will have some bearing, but in quantifying that, I don't have the answer off the top of my head.
All right. Seeing no other questions from the audience, I'll take the last one. And this is sort of out of left field. So I saw that your former advisor from Caltech, Joe Kirschvink, has recently published on human magnetoreception.
Yes.
I was wondering if you would like to comment on that.
I will say that Joe has spent about 30 years working on this problem of whether humans can detect magnetic fields or not. And I think that a lot of the tension in terms of accepting whether that answer was correct or not was, could the human brain, they basically like take a EEG of your brain and just kind of see how, your brain lights up under different stimuli, and really excluding any other possible sources of stimuli that could create parts of your brain and make it like light up. And I think over the decades, they've really eliminated all the other possibilities. And so I buy the result that Joe has advanced. I think that it's pretty compelling. And I think one thing that's interesting, or the part that makes me believe it more, is that you can only detect magnetic fields if they're moving in like a certain angle or if they're oriented in a certain angle. I think if it was some other stimuli, then the motion of a magnetic field or a change in magnetic field would show up like all the time. But the fact that you don't see it all the time, you only see it in certain directions of field motion where all other things are being held equal, it kind of sells it to me. Joe, I don't know if you've seen him give a talk on this, but one thing I found that was also very interesting was that, it's published in, what's the journal? I think it's called eNeuro. I think that's the name of the journal, and Joe's student wrote that paper a couple years ago. The other thing that I found was interesting was that people's magnetic sense or directional sensitivity to changes in magnetic field varies based on what hemisphere you're from. So people who are from the southern hemisphere have a different magnetic polarity in their brain, kind of, or like a different, they're sensitive to like one angle, but not the other angle, versus people from the northern hemisphere have one angle and not the southern hemisphere angle, which was also really cool because it might say something about how your brain has sort of calibrated itself. And another thing that's interesting is that if you've had an MRI, it doesn't work for you because your brain may have been kind of reset by the exposure to the magnetic fields during the brain scan. So that's also another thing that I find fascinating.
All
But yeah,
right, very cool.
I
Good
think
to
we have
get.
a superpower.
Yeah, good to get a second opinion on that. So great. Well, thank you once again, Sonia. What a wonderful talk, and thanks for joining us at UW Astrobiology for the day.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. See you all later. Bye.
All right, take care, everyone.